When he laughed and said, "That little business of yours will never amount to anything," I didn't respond. I just watched the man I loved turn into my first investor without realizing it. The sound of his derision seemed to hang in the air of our meticulously designed kitchen, each mocking syllable bouncing off the marble countertops I'd chosen with such care. Alex stood holding his expensive scotch, his tailored suit a stark contrast to my flour-dusted apron. I'd been genuinely excited to show him my first 20 online orders, the printed confirmations arranged neatly on the counter like precious artifacts. He'd glanced at them for precisely 3 seconds before the condescending commentary began. "Candles, Rena. You spent your chemistry degree making scented wax." Something fundamental shifted in that moment, not suddenly, but profoundly, like continental plates moving beneath the surface of a calm ocean. The woman who'd once hung on his every word quietly detached, observing him become the living embodiment of every doubt I'd ever silenced within myself. I carefully folded the order printouts, the paper crisp and significant in my hands, and slipped them into my recipe binder between pages for chocolate chip cookies and beef bourguignon. He didn't notice the transformation happening right beside him, too busy being the star of his own story to recognize he'd just become a footnote in mine. His laughter the catalyst for a revolution he would never see coming until it was far too late to stop its momentum. At dinner parties, he performed our relationship like carefully rehearsed theater for his colleagues and banking friends. "Rena sells candles," he'd announce with a condescending chuckle, as if describing a child's charming but ultimately insignificant lemonade stand. I'd stand beside him in elegant dresses he'd purchased, smiling graciously as his friends patted my arm with patronizing sympathy. "How quaint," they'd murmur, their eyes already moving toward more important conversations about mergers and market fluctuations. What they didn't see was the detailed spreadsheet hidden on my phone beneath the linen tablecloth, the real-time tracking of inventory levels, the growing customer database, the carefully calculated profit margins that already surpassed many small businesses. While they debated stock options and corporate acquisitions, I was building something that couldn't be diluted or acquired. A brand, a reputation, a loyal customer base. Every laugh, every dismissive comment, every patronizing smile became kindling for a fire they couldn't see burning just beneath my composed exterior. I gradually stopped trying to explain the business and started studying their weaknesses, their blind spots about e-commerce, their arrogance about traditional business models, their complete ignorance of the digital marketplace where my empire was quietly taking root. Their laughter became the perfect camouflage for my growing ambition, their condescension the fuel for my determination. But that's when karma stepped in, weaving our fates together in ways none of them could possibly anticipate, setting the stage for a reckoning that would rewrite all our stories. The 3-car garage became my sanctuary, my laboratory, and my war room, transforming from a storage space for luxury vehicles into the headquarters of my quiet revolution. While Alex entertained important clients in our perfectly staged living room, discussing million-dollar deals, I was out here building my future between storage bins and holiday decorations, the scent of melting, soy wax, and essential oils replacing the cloying perfume of corporate politics and ambition. I taught myself everything through relentless research and trial and error. SEO optimization to ensure my products appeared first in searches, social media algorithms to build an organic following, international shipping regulations to expand globally, supply chain logistics to ensure seamless operations. My hands, once perfectly manicured for charity galas and society events, now bore the marks of hot glue guns and cardboard cuts, each small injury a badge of honor. Every night after Alex fell asleep, satisfied with his day's accomplishments, I'd slip back out to the garage, the blue light of my laptop illuminating stacks of shipping boxes like monuments to my growing determination. The first 1,000 orders came slowly, each one a validation of my vision. The next 10,000 came faster, a tidal wave of proof against his persistent skepticism. I no longer needed his approval. I had something far more reliable: data. Sales graphs climbing steadily upward, glowing customer testimonials pouring in, revenue doubling every quarter while he remained blissfully unaware, still referring to my little hobby at cocktail parties with a fond, condescending smile. The garage wasn't just a workspace. It was the birthplace of the woman I was becoming, the command center for an operation that would soon eclipse his own in both profit and purpose. "You care more about that business than this marriage," he shouted, his face flushed with expensive wine and wounded pride, the crystal glass trembling in his hand. I stood calmly wiping vanilla fragrance oil from my fingers, the sweet scent clinging to my skin like invisible armor. He discovered my separate business checking account statement, the one with balances that now rivaled his substantial quarterly bonuses, the numbers undeniable proof of my success. "You're never present anymore. Always hidden away in that garage, always staring at your phone, always distracted by your little project." I watched him unravel, this man who'd once seemed so powerful and self-assured, now visibly threatened by stacks of shipping boxes and jars of scented wax, his ego bruised by my independent achievement. "No," I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the pounding of my heart. "I just care about something that actually grows." His silence that followed was more revealing than any confession, more damning than any accusation. In that suspended moment, he understood with chilling clarity that I was no longer the woman he'd married, the agreeable, supportive wife who organized his social calendar and smiled prettily at his business events. I had created something that existed completely outside his validation, something that thrived without his permission or participation, something that had become more meaningful to me than his approval. He stared at me as if seeing a stranger, and I realized with devastating certainty. He had always preferred the version of me he could control, the woman who existed in his shadow. The argument ended not with resolution or reconciliation, but with this stark mutual recognition. We were standing on opposite sides of a chasm that kept widening with every candle I sold, every shipment I sent, every customer who valued what I created. I filed the incorporation paperwork on a Tuesday morning while Alex was away at his quarterly board meeting, the courthouse nearly empty at that early hour. Renavale Holdings, LLC. The name sounded substantial, professional, completely untethered from the cute little business narrative he'd constructed for me. The business attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Miranda, raised a questioning eyebrow when I listed all major assets under the new holding company, including the commercial kitchen space I'd quietly purchased using early profits, the transaction hidden among household expenses. "Your husband won't be involved in any capacity?" she asked, her pen poised above the documents. "No," I said firmly, signing my name with a flourish that felt like a declaration of independence, each letter a step toward freedom. He never noticed the incorporation papers in our shared filing cabinet, never asked about the business license I'd framed and hung in my garage office, never wondered about the separate tax ID number. He was too absorbed in his important work to see the legal and financial foundation being laid right beneath his feet, too confident in his superiority to imagine I might be building something significant. I structured everything with meticulous care, separate business banking accounts, distinct tax identification numbers, clean legal boundaries between his world and mine. The careful separation of our financial lives felt more meaningful than any romantic gesture he'd ever made, more binding than any wedding vow. It was the quiet, practical beginning of my autonomy, the first brick in a wall that would eventually protect everything I built. Little did he know, watching me from across the dinner table with benign condescension, everything was about to change in ways his corporate mind couldn't possibly anticipate. The seeds I planted today destined to grow into a forest that would eventually shade his entire empire. While Alex watched football and scrolled through investment portfolios, cheering for teams and tracking stocks, I was building a different kind of wealth, connections, knowledge, and strategic relationships. Online entrepreneur forums became my unofficial business school, filled with savvy women who turned kitchen table ideas into seven-figure enterprises, their collective wisdom more valuable than any MBA. They taught me sophisticated tax strategies that protected profits, creative write-offs that maximized deductions, and legal structures that shielded personal assets from business liabilities. I learned how to strategically leverage debt for growth, how to negotiate fiercely with manufacturers, how to protect my intellectual property from copycats. One pivotal conversation with a brilliant entrepreneur named Maya who'd built a jewelry empire from her studio apartment, changed everything. "Always make sure your business owns the assets, not you personally," she advised during a late-night video call. "That way, if anything ever happens with your marriage or other relationships." Her voice trailed off meaningfully, and I understood completely. I began methodically transferring everything of value: the commercial property, the specialized equipment, the customer database, even the brand trademarks, into the LLC's name, creating an impenetrable legal fortress. Meanwhile, Alex remained blissfully oblivious, occasionally making affectionate jokes about my late-night crafting sessions to his friends, never asking what I was actually doing during those hours, never wondering about the business books I studied with the intensity he reserved for stock market reports and financial analyses. Each piece of knowledge became another brick in my foundation, each new understanding another weapon in my arsenal, each connection another thread in the safety net I was weaving beneath my future. The quiet rebellion was underway, and he was too distracted by his own reflection to notice the revolution brewing in the garage. The business turned its first substantial profit, $87,000 in a single quarter, the number glowing on my spreadsheet like a sunrise after a long, dark night of doubt and determination. Alex was simultaneously planning a luxury vacation to celebrate his recent promotion. I was quietly reinvesting every dollar of that profit into scaling operations and securing our future. While he researched 5-star resorts in Bora Bora, I negotiated with a manufacturer for bulk pricing on glass jars that would save thousands. While he bragged about his annual bonus at dinner parties, name-dropping exclusive clubs and expensive hobbies, I discreetly acquired the vacant warehouse space adjacent to my commercial kitchen, doubling my operational capacity. The money wasn't for designer handbags or fancy vacations. It was for freedom, for security, for building something that couldn't be taken away. I hired my first official employees, 2 remarkable women from the local shelter who needed flexible work around their children's schedules, paying them generously and providing on-site childcare, creating the supportive environment I wished I'd had. They worked with a fierce loyalty that corporate bonuses could never purchase, their dedication born from genuine respect and shared purpose. The business was evolving beyond merely proving Alex wrong. It had become something larger, something with its own heartbeat and mission, something that would survive whatever storms gathered on our marital horizon. Every decision I made was about creating something lasting and meaningful, building not just a company but a legacy. And that's when the twist hit, setting in motion an inevitable chain of events that would forever alter the balance of power in our relationship, the foundation of his arrogance about to be shaken by the very enterprise he dismissed as insignificant. The family dinner was entirely Alex's idea, a carefully orchestrated opportunity to showcase his new promotion and substantial raise in front of his impressed parents and competitive siblings. I arrived late, fresh from personally fulfilling a massive wholesale order for 500 units, my hands still faintly smelling of bergamot and sage from the final quality check. "There she is," Alex announced too loudly, pulling me possessively against his side before his captive audience. "My entrepreneurial wife, still playing with her candles, I see." His family chuckled indulgently, their smiles patronizing. "How much can you really make selling wax anyway?" his brother asked around a mouthful of expensive steak, not bothering to swallow first. Alex answered for me, his tone dripping with condescension. "Enough for pedicures and coffee money." The table erupted in unified laughter, a chorus of dismissal that should have wounded me. I excused myself to the powder room, not to cry, as they undoubtedly assumed, but to check the notification that had just lit up my phone with promising urgency. Our business account had received a wire transfer, $152,000 from a luxury hotel chain for their quarterly order, the largest single payment to date. I stared at the number, then at my reflection in the ornate gilt mirror. The woman looking back didn't appear humiliated. She looked patient, knowing, her eyes holding secrets they couldn't begin to fathom. I smoothed my dress, fixed my smile, and returned to the dining room, my expression now genuinely amused. Let them laugh, these people who measured worth by title and salary. They were laughing at a character Alex had invented, not the woman quietly building an empire in their very midst, her success already eclipsing their narrow understanding of ambition. The unexpected email from the national luxury department store chain felt both astonishing and inevitable. They wanted to carry my products in all 200 locations, a distribution deal that would transform my business overnight. Their corporate legal team sent over the standard vendor agreement, expecting a quick, grateful signature from the small business owner they assumed would be overwhelmed by their attention. Instead, I had my attorney draft a thorough counterproposal with one non-negotiable condition clearly highlighted. All contracts would be exclusively with Renovale Holdings, LLC, and my name would appear as the sole signing authority for all matters. They pushed back initially, their lead negotiator suggesting it would be simpler administratively to put everything under joint marital ownership, the standard practice they assumed I would follow. I held firm, my resolve unshakable. My company, my name, my authority, I told their momentarily stunned negotiator during our conference call, my voice calm but absolute. Meanwhile, Alex was complaining loudly about his own contract negotiations at work, the details of his frustration filling our kitchen over dinner. They want personal guarantees, he grumbled, stabbing his food with uncharacteristic aggression. Putting everything we own on the line for this merger. The house, the investments, everything. I nodded sympathetically, while silently celebrating my own negotiation victory, the stark contrast between our positions not lost on me. The department store finally agreed to my terms after 10 days of tense discussion, and I signed the final documents the same afternoon Alex signed his risky personal guarantees, both of us making fateful commitments that would determine our futures. Only mine protected everything I'd built, while his risked everything he took for granted, the divergence in our strategies about to yield dramatically different results. Alex continued to believe I was running a modest, almost whimsical side business, something to keep me occupied while he handled the real work of wealth building and corporate advancement. In reality, I was constructing a sophisticated distribution network that quietly intersected with his company's own supply chain at multiple strategic points, the connections invisible to his arrogant gaze. My expanding warehouse now shared a physical wall with his company's main distribution center, the proximity allowing me to observe their operations closely. My primary shipping provider was the same multinational corporation his firm used for international logistics, giving me insight into their weaknesses and inefficiencies. I'd even discreetly hired his company's former operations manager as a part-time consultant, learning all the vulnerabilities in their systems from someone who knew them intimately. While Alex bragged at dinner parties about cutting costs by outsourcing his IT infrastructure to the lowest bidder, I was building a robust, secure e-commerce platform that could scale globally without compromising quality or security. He never connected these dots, never wondered why I asked such specific questions about his work challenges, never realized I was studying his business the way a general studies enemy territory, identifying weaknesses, anticipating movements, preparing strategies. The double life was both exhausting and exhilarating, playing the supportive, somewhat scatterbrained wife by day while meticulously building my escape route and offensive position by night. Every conversation about his work, every business dinner anecdote, every casual remark about corporate struggles became valuable intelligence I could use to strengthen my own position. The student was quietly surpassing the master in both strategy and execution, and he was too convinced of his own superiority to notice the paradigm shifting dangerously beneath his feet. The formal IRS notification arrived on a crisp Monday morning, the envelope thick with ominous potential. Alex tore it open with his usual impatience, his face gradually paling as he read the dense paragraphs about discrepancies, required documentation, and potential penalties. "It's nothing serious," he told me, attempting nonchalance though his trembling hands betrayed his anxiety. "Just a routine check, happens to all successful businesses." But routine rapidly evolved into something more concerning when the assigned auditors discovered he'd been carelessly commingling personal and business expenses for years, a sloppy practice his expensive accounting firm had somehow overlooked or ignored. As they dug deeper into his financial records, they uncovered something far more interesting and problematic. Several significant assets he'd consistently claimed as legitimate business expenses were actually legally registered under Rena Vale Holdings, LLC, my separate company. This discovery created a fascinating dilemma for the auditors. If these were legitimate business assets, why were they titled under his wife's independent company? And if they were actually personal assets, why were they being systematically written off as business expenses, potentially defrauding the government? Alex tried to brush it off as a simple paperwork error, an understandable oversight in a complex business. But the IRS doesn't deal in casual explanations or convenient excuses. They deal in documentation, in paperwork, in legal titles and cold, hard facts. And my paperwork was impeccable, my documentation thorough, my legal standing unassailable, a fortress of evidence against his castle of assumptions. He burst into my workspace like a human hurricane, waving printed emails and official audit notices, his face mottled with a dangerous combination of anger and mounting fear. "Why is your business name plastered all over my corporate documents?" he demanded, his voice cracking with barely controlled panic. I looked up calmly from the shipment I was carefully packing, my hands remaining steady despite his dramatic entrance. "What do you mean, Alex?" I asked, my tone deliberately measured. "The IRS audit. They're saying half my key business assets are legally registered under Rena Vale Holdings. The commercial property. The company vehicles, even the damn warehouse space we use for storage." I wiped my hands slowly on a clean towel, taking my time to respond, allowing the tension to build. "Oh, that," I said finally, my voice even. "When you needed to quickly acquire that additional warehouse space last year during your sudden expansion, the seller required immediate full payment. You asked me to handle the transaction since you were traveling for that important conference. Remember?" His face went completely blank, then gradually filled with dawning horror as the memory returned. He'd signed whatever documents I placed in front of him before rushing to the airport, too busy and self-important to read the fine print, too confident to question my handling of the matter. "You registered my business property in your company's name," he whispered, the reality beginning to dawn. "Our company's name," I corrected gently, almost kindly. "Rena Vale Holdings. You're listed as a minority stakeholder, of course, with appropriate documentation." The silence that followed was more devastating than any shouting match, more final than any slammed door, the sound of his entire world-view collapsing in on itself. The morning the bank systematically froze his accounts, I was in our kitchen brewing coffee, listening to the satisfying rhythmic grind of expensive beans, the ordinary domestic scene contrasting sharply with the financial cataclysm about to unfold. Alex's scream from his home office was visceral, raw, a sound of pure panic I'd never heard from him before. "What do you mean frozen?" he shouted into the phone, his voice rising with each word. I poured fresh cream into my favorite ceramic mug, watching it swirl through the dark liquid in hypnotic patterns. One by one, throughout that morning, his cards declined with embarrassing finality. The platinum Amex at his usual Starbucks, the corporate card at the luxury hotel where he was scheduled to meet important clients, even his personal debit card at the gas station near our home. He called me, panic sharp and unmistakable in his voice. "Something's terribly wrong with all the accounts." I took a slow sip of my perfectly prepared coffee. "Have you talked directly to the bank, Alex? They can usually explain these things." By noon, he was a ghost of his formerly confident self, packing and pleading with faceless bankers who offered only scripted apologies and vague references to legal proceedings. The same man who'd frequently mocked my little invoices and petty cash flow now couldn't pay for his lunch, his dry cleaning, or his parking. The irony was so perfect it felt almost orchestrated by some cosmic force of justice. I watched his carefully constructed empire of arrogance crumble in real time, built as it was on the shaky foundation of his own assumed superiority, now collapsing under the weight of his oversight and my meticulous planning. His accountant's urgent call came through on speakerphone, the man's usually calm voice now tight with professional anxiety. "Alex, I've been through everything twice. All the disputed assets are legally owned by Rena Vale Holdings. She's the majority stakeholder and controlling interest." Alex's face was a mask of pure, uncomprehending confusion. "She what? How is that even possible? What are you talking about? According to the signed documents, you transferred controlling interest when you used her company to acquire those assets last year. It was all perfectly legal and properly executed. I stood quietly in the doorway, listening to the conversation I'd known was inevitable from the moment I'd filed the incorporation papers, the pieces of my long-term strategy falling into place with satisfying precision. Alex turned slowly to face me, his eyes wide with dawning disbelief and something uglier, betrayal. "You own my business?" he asked, the words barely audible. "Not your business," I corrected gently, almost sympathetically. "The assets your business uses to operate. There's a significant legal difference." The confusion on his face was gradually replaced by a darker, more painful understanding. The realization that he'd been thoroughly outmaneuvered by the woman he'd consistently considered his intellectual inferior, the partner he'd patronized for years. The complex chess match he didn't know we were playing had just ended abruptly, and checkmate looked nothing like he'd ever imagined it would, the victory belonging to the player he'd underestimated at every turn. He confronted me in the formal living room where he'd once held court like a modern-day king, now looking strangely small and diminished in the spacious, elegantly appointed room. "You planned this," he accused, his voice trembling with the raw edge of betrayal. "You set me up from the very beginning. This was all some long con." I set down the book I'd been reading, a biography of a famously underestimated female entrepreneur who'd faced similar skepticism on her path to success. "No, Alex," I said, my voice calm and measured, contrasting sharply with his emotional turmoil. "You ignored me. There's a profound difference." I gestured around us at the beautiful home we shared. "You were so busy playing the brilliant businessman, so absorbed in your own reflection, that you never noticed I was learning, growing, evolving. You mocked my detailed spreadsheets, laughed at my careful business plans, dismissed my incremental successes as mere luck or feminine hobbyism. But I was always watching, always learning, always paying attention." His anger visibly deflated, replaced by something more vulnerable and devastating, shame. He'd been so certain of his own superiority, so convinced of my secondary role, that he'd completely missed the quiet revolution happening right beside him in our marriage, in our home, in our life together. The reckoning wasn't ultimately about revenge or punishment. It was about recognition, about visibility. For the first time in our relationship, he was seeing me clearly, not as his wife, not as his supporter, but as his equal. Or perhaps, given the current circumstances and the legal documents spread across our coffee table, as his superior. His once stable firm began bleeding clients and capital with terrifying, unstoppable speed, the downward spiral accelerating daily. Vendors refused to extend further credit without my company's explicit guarantee, which I quietly declined to provide. Business partners pulled out of pending deals, spooked by the ongoing IRS investigation and the frozen assets, the bad news spreading through industry circles like wildfire. I watched from the sidelines with the same detached calm I'd carefully cultivated through years of his condescension and dismissal, my emotions firmly under control. The business news sites started running speculative pieces about his company. Sudden and puzzling collapse. Anonymous sources whispering about financial mismanagement and questionable accounting practices. They didn't know the half of the real story, the personal dynamics that had precipitated this professional downfall. Former colleagues who'd once laughed affectionately at my candle business now called me directly, their voices tinged with newfound respect and barely concealed fear. They'd seen the legal filings showing my controlling interest in the very assets their own businesses depended upon for operation. The collapse was both spectacular and strangely quiet, like a towering building imploding in slow motion, each floor crumbling in careful sequence, the structure giving way to its own flawed engineering. And through it all, I remained the calm, composed center of the storm, efficiently running my thriving business, fulfilling customer orders, building something substantial that wouldn't collapse because it was constructed on solid foundation of careful planning, not ego-driven assumptions. The house grew profoundly quiet in ways it never had before, the absence of noise more noticeable than any sound. No more booming business calls conducted on speakerphone, no more boasting about closed deals and defeated rivals, no more condescending explanations of financial concepts I already understood perfectly well. Alex moved through rooms like a ghost, the silence surrounding him a stark contrast to the noisy, performative confidence that had once filled this space to overflowing. I'd find him staring blankly out windows, his shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat I'd never witnessed before. The man who'd filled countless dinner parties with his loud opinions and expert commentary now ate his meals quietly, occasionally glancing at me across the table as if seeing a mysterious stranger. The silence between us wasn't hostile or angry. It was deeply contemplative, the heavy quiet that follows a devastating storm after the damage has been surveyed and assessed. I didn't gloat over his downfall or lecture him about his mistakes. I simply continued building my business, the steady, purposeful rhythm of my work a quiet counterpoint to his stunned stillness, the clicking of my keyboard the only sound in the evenings. In the silence, he was finally learning the difficult lessons his own noise and arrogance had prevented him from hearing all those years, the truth settling in the spaces between words. His nervous partners requested an emergency meeting in the corporate boardroom where he'd once held unquestioned sway, the same imposing room where he'd made countless decisions that affected hundreds of employees. I arrived alone, dressed in a simple but powerfully cut navy suit, carrying only a slim tablet containing all the relevant legal and financial documents. They sat around the massive mahogany table, the same group of men who'd frequently patted my head and called my business ambitions adorable at company holiday parties. "Rena," the senior partner began, his voice carefully neutral, professionally respectful. "We understand you control the essential assets this business requires to continue operating." I nodded calmly, saying nothing, allowing the silence to emphasize their precarious position. "We'd like to formally propose a merger, your successful company with ours, with you installed as the new CEO of the combined entity." I let the silence stretch uncomfortably, watching them squirm in their expensive leather chairs. These were the men who'd consistently mocked my little business, dismissed my professional capabilities, underestimated my intelligence and ambition at every turn. Now they were offering me the coveted chair at the head of their own table, the ultimate position of power. I looked directly at Alex, who sat pale and completely silent at the far end of the table, avoiding my gaze. "Yes," I said finally, the single word definitive. "I'll take over, officially." The word hung in the air between us, a complete sentence that contained multitudes of meaning, a universe of changed dynamics in two simple syllables. The leadership transition happened with stunning, almost surreal speed. The legal documents signed, the announcements made, the corporate structure reorganized. Suddenly, I was the official CEO of the merged holdings, his former company and my thriving business, now one unified entity operating entirely under my leadership and vision. My first day in the corner office that had once been his, I didn't redecorate with feminine touches or make dramatic symbolic changes. I simply adjusted the executive chair to the correct height for my frame and began working with focused determination. The empire he'd frequently mocked as insignificant was now his employer. The little business he'd patronized now signing his paychecks and determining his professional future. Former colleagues who'd once dismissed me with affectionate condescension now addressed me as Ms. Vale with careful, measured respect, their eyes never quite meeting mine directly. Alex was assigned a modest office down the hall, a small, windowless space that perfectly reflected his diminished position in the new hierarchy. I didn't celebrate the dramatic reversal with champagne toasts or triumphant gloating. Instead, I celebrated by immediately implementing the progressive changes I'd been planning for years: generous parental leave policies, comprehensive equal pay audits, flexible work arrangements that acknowledged employees' whole lives. The shift wasn't merely about power or position. It was about proving conclusively that my way of doing business, thoughtful, inclusive, strategic, and sustainable, was fundamentally better than his aggressive, ego-driven approach had ever been. He appeared at my office doorway 2 weeks later, hovering uncertainly like a subordinate unsure of his welcome, his former confidence completely evaporated. "Rena," he began, then awkwardly corrected himself. "Ms. Vale, I want to apologize." I looked up from the detailed quarterly reports I was analyzing, studying him closely. The man I once loved deeply, the man who'd systematically underestimated me, the man now standing nervously in my office as a mere employee. "You're not sorry," I said gently but directly, not unkindly. "You're scared. There's a significant difference between those two things." He opened his mouth automatically to protest, then closed it just as quickly, recognizing the fundamental truth in my assessment. He wasn't genuinely sorry for his years of condescending behavior, for his dismissive attitude toward my ambitions, for his patronizing treatment of my capabilities. He was sorry about the severe consequences he now faced, sorry his actions had backfired so spectacularly. The distinction mattered profoundly, and we both knew it. "I'd like a chance to prove myself," he said finally, the words clearly difficult for him to utter. I considered him carefully, this man who'd once been my entire world, now reduced to asking for opportunities from the woman he'd frequently called a mere hobbyist. "We'll see," I said, returning my attention to the spreadsheets before me. The dismissal was polite but firm, the same tone he'd often used with me when he considered my ideas unimportant, the reversal both poetic and perfectly justified. I didn't fire him from the merged company, though I easily could have, and many in my position would have. Instead, I created a specific position for him, assistant to the operations manager, with a minimal salary that barely covered his car payment and commuting costs, let alone his previous lifestyle. The profound humiliation of the role wasn't primarily about revenge, though that element certainly existed. It was about education, about ensuring he truly understood the experience he'd inflicted on others through his arrogance. He needed to intimately understand what it felt like to be relatively powerless in a hierarchy. To have your work systematically undervalued, to struggle financially despite working hard, to be condescended to by those with more authority. For the first time in his privileged life, he experienced the insecurity and frustration he'd frequently mocked in others, the daily reality for many people he'd overlooked. I watched him slowly transform under this pressure, the arrogant, domineering businessman gradually giving way to a humbler, more observant, more thoughtful man. He took detailed notes in meetings instead of dominating the conversations. He asked genuine questions instead of pretending to know all the answers. He actually listened when others spoke. Meanwhile, I ran the expanded company with the quiet, steady competence he'd never believed me capable of demonstrating. Profits grew steadily, employee satisfaction scores soared to unprecedented heights, and the business thrived under leadership that valued substance over swagger, collaboration over domination. The lesson wasn't just for him alone. It was for everyone in the organization who'd ever underestimated the quiet, determined woman in the room, the proof now evident in every quarterly report. With the merged company successfully stabilized and increasingly profitable under my leadership, I established the Veil Foundation, a carefully structured nonprofit organization dedicated to providing grants, resources, and mentorship to women entrepreneurs at every stage of their journey. We funded business incubators specifically for female founders, offered comprehensive childcare support for mother entrepreneurs, created networking opportunities that bypassed old boys clubs. Every grant certificate we awarded bore the distinctive logo of Alex's former company, a deliberate piece of poetic irony that wasn't lost on anyone who knew our history, especially him. The women we helped through the foundation had stories hauntingly similar to my own, innovative ideas dismissed, serious ambitions mocked, proven capabilities systematically underestimated by partners, families, and financial institutions. Watching these women gradually flourish with our support felt like healing something wounded in myself, like repaying a debt to my former struggling self. Alex, to his emerging credit, eventually volunteered to mentor some of the foundation's participants, sharing the hard-won lessons from his own dramatic professional downfall, his perspective now valuable precisely because of his failures. The transfer of wealth and influence from his arrogant, passed to these determined women's promising futures felt like closing a significant circle, like restoring balance. The money and resources that had once been used primarily to bolster his ego were now funding dreams he would have automatically dismissed not long ago. It was, I reflected, the most satisfying and meaningful profit the business had ever generated. The business section headline was deliciously understated yet unmistakable in its implication. Wife's small business becomes empire. Husband now works for her. The article itself detailed my professional rise and his corresponding fall with journalistic detachment, sticking closely to verifiable facts and financial figures. But the internet, of course, enthusiastically filled in the juicy gaps with glorious, widespread speculation. Memes circulated wildly across social media platforms, tweets exploded with commentary, and my direct messages quickly filled with heartfelt messages from women worldwide sharing their own stories of being underestimated in business and relationships. I gave exactly one carefully controlled interview to a respected business publication, strategically shaping the narrative to emphasize forward movement. It was never primarily about revenge, I told the seasoned reporter across the table. It was always about building something genuinely meaningful and sustainable. The resulting article didn't mention the frozen bank accounts or the ongoing IRS investigation, focusing instead on business strategy, growth metrics, and leadership philosophy. Alex completely avoided the press spotlight, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that his old golf partners had taken to sarcastically calling him Mr. Vale, behind his back at the country club, the ultimate humiliation in his former social circle. The public embarrassment was essentially collateral damage in my larger plan, not the central goal. But I can't honestly claim it didn't satisfy some deep, long-wounded part of me that remembered every condescending pat on the head, every dismissive comment about my hobby. He asked me over a quiet dinner at home one night, a simple meal I'd prepared, a far cry from the extravagant restaurants we'd once frequented regularly, the setting reflecting our changed circumstances. Was it worth it? He asked, his voice stripped of its former arrogance, now just tired and contemplative. Losing us, the marriage, everything we built together, was building the business worth systematically destroying our relationship. I set down my fork deliberately, considering the man across from me older, visibly wiser, truly humbled by experience. It wasn't revenge, Alex, I said, my voice even and clear. It was recognition. I just finally stopped waiting for yours. The simple truth settled between us in the quiet dining room. Our marriage hadn't ultimately ended because of the business's success. It had ended because he couldn't, or wouldn't, see me as a genuine equal, as a separate person with her own ambitions and capabilities. The business was merely the vehicle that delivered that painful, fundamental truth to our doorstep, the catalyst that revealed existing cracks in our foundation. We finished the meal in surprisingly comfortable silence. Two people who'd once been passionate lovers, now something more complex and nuanced, former spouses, current employer and employee, and perhaps, eventually, with time and healing, genuine friends. Now, every quarter when I sign the profit distribution sheets, my pen hovering over the impressive numbers, I remember that pivotal night in the garage, his mocking laughter, his unshakable arrogance, his absolute certainty that my ambitions were charming but ultimately insignificant. The figures on the page now tell a different story entirely, one of sustainable growth, remarkable stability, and quiet, undeniable triumph. Revenge didn't bankrupt him personally or professionally. It simply balanced the cosmic books between what he'd consistently taken for granted and what he'd carelessly given away, between the woman I was expected to be and the woman I chose to become. The business has since outgrown the garage, then the warehouse, then even the corporate headquarters we now occupy. But I've deliberately kept one single candle from that very first batch, the slightly imperfect one with the crooked wick that he'd specifically pointed to as definitive proof of my amateurism. It sits prominently on my desk as a permanent reminder that every great empire begins with a single, small, often dismissed flame. Because in the grand karma diaries of life and business, the ones they casually label dreamers and hobbyists and amateurs always end up signing the official paychecks, and more importantly, writing the final, authoritative version of the story for everyone to read. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent spreadsheets, signed checks, and poetic justice paid in full. He mocked her dreams, and now she signs his paycheck. Because karma doesn't shout, it simply balances the books. Have you ever seen arrogance turn into regret? Share your story below, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life karma stories like this one.